It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, mate, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome to Hard Hats and High Vis. We're in week 23 and week 23 coincides with a very profound event as we record. They're gearing up in the UK for the royal funeral, the funeral of QE2, Elizabeth II. Joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. How are you, mate?
In the pink, mate. Going very pink. Nicely here.
Got the black on for the royal funeral today, as usual. I know that's. I know we're working on auditory in terms of our recording, but I can see Jack in Hong Kong looking back at me with the black T-shirt on. Very respectful, Jack. Absolutely appropriate. And never mind that it's the same gear you wear every day, but
are there other colours, mate?
I actually think black is not a colour technically, but there you are. Yes, you're being very, very respectful. When we talk about the royal funeral and it's going to be occurring within hours, the guest list is absolutely spectacular. There are people from all royal families around the world, Jack, including some I didn't even know existed. Did you know that there is an hereditary Prince Alwa of Liechtenstein?
I did know that Liechtenstein's had some kind of royal family. Yes, I did.
The Grand Duke of Luxembourg will be there.
The Luxembourgis, yeah.
Yeah. The King of Tonga, we all know about, normally gets around his own chair. He's a large human being, I think some of his predecessors were. I think did turn up at the marriage of, I think two kings of Tonga ago, turned up to the royal marriage of Charles and Diana and had to have his own seat brought for him because he was a very large human being. We've got the Salman of Saudi Arabia, the Emir of the State of Qatar, King of Norway, King of Netherlands, Crown Prince of Monaco, the Malaysian Sultan. That was another one I did not know. So yes, Jack, it seems like there are monarchies absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, if you compare this funeral with, say, the funerals of Queen Victoria, Edward VII and the Queen's own father, well, at Victoria's funeral there were lots of royals because most of the royals around the world, or particularly in Europe, were related to it.
Well, they were cousins, yeah,
or grandchildren. The emperor of the Germans was a grandson. If I recall.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And similarly for Edward VII's funeral, but by the time it got to the funeral of the Queen's father, George VI, there were plenty of royals, but in terms of political leaders there, it tended to be the ambassador from somewhere. You know, the United States sent Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State. The President of France was there, but pretty much everybody else was an ambassador. On this occasion, all the presidents and prime ministers are turning up as well.
Yeah, there are a few omissions, but, basically it would have to be the greatest collection of world leaders I think the world has ever seen, Jack. I mean, obviously Biden is there, Truss is there, but we've got the Prime Minister of Palestine, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. Of course, Justin Trudeau will be there, Jack. He'll be in black money. He won't be cosplaying this time. Emmanuel Macron is there, the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins, rather wonderful fellow. President of Italy, Sergio Mattarella. Jacinda Ardern is there. She had a little story to tell about what advice Elizabeth gave her about being a political figure and also being a new mum. And that advice was, you just get on with it. I can't recall a time where where we've seen a collection of the world's leaders gather in one place. And you would have to say that this is perhaps a gathering of the West rather than the East. Perhaps certainly not there is Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping.
The distinguished British journalist Andrew Neil put it rather well, I think. He said, in his lifetime, I can think of only 3 deaths with similar international impact: the assassination of President Kennedy, the death of Winston Churchill in 1965, and of Nelson Mandela in 2013. But the global grieving and the turn up for this today is even better than all 3 of those.
Yes, and it's not just presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, sultans, princes. We also have, a great gathering of diplomats around the world. The Secretary General of NATO will be there. The President of the EU, the President of the EU Council have been invited. Celebrity-wise, we're not entirely sure, but we believe Sir David Attenborough will be at the funeral, and possibly David Beckham, Jack.
Golden balls.
Yes, well, he certainly had meetings with the Queen. It'll be interesting to see how. Just a curiosity, really. But I mean, does this gathering present an opportunity for diplomacy, a genuine opportunity for diplomacy, or is it that diplomatic matters and other potential problems around the world will be pushed to one side?
Well, usually what happens when world leaders are all in the one spot for whatever reason, they have a few little meetings in the side rooms, have breakfast meetings, etc., to catch up and deal with a few problems that they've got. I've read accounts of Harold Holt's funeral. Remember LBJ turned up for that, as did various other dignitaries, and there was a great deal of toing and froing in the hotel, so they made use of the time they were down in Melbourne. And I should think this would happen here as well.
Yes, you would expect a lot of that stuff, and I suspect that it'll be setting up for other meetings later on.
Yeah.
Yes, notable absences, as I said before, Vladimir Putin for rather obvious reasons, I would imagine, and Donald Trump seems to have been left out, Jack, although I do believe are the Clintons going? Is W going? I mean, we're talking about living presidents now.
I didn't think they were, to be frank.
Well, it does raise the other issue is that the beast, the presidential vehicle, known as the beast because it weighs more than a tank, will be used. So Biden will be transported around, but I think the rest of them have to catch the bus.
Yes, they won't be on the tube, but they'll have to catch the bus.
Yes, it'll be a nice bus. There'll be nice buses. Yeah, but the beast will be making its way to wherever the funeral cortege is. It'll be really interesting to see just exactly what, if anything, arises from these meetings. I suspect not very much, but there will be a lot of dialogue, and there may well be plans set in place for the future. I did see our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was actually imploring or at least acknowledging that King Charles III should continue to talk about climate change, Jack.
Yes, it's always a curious thing. People are very keen to encourage a constitutional monarch to talk about issues where they're pretty confident that he's going to agree with them.
Yeah, that's right. But what he can't do, what King Charles, III, can't do is start talking about matters that might be in conflict with government policy, or stand as a potential point of conflict with the government.
It's not even a question of being in conflict with the government. What the monarch shouldn't do is talk about issues that have a political context. You can't be on one side or the other. It doesn't matter which side you're on, you're wrong. You've got to steer away from issues that are inherently political.
So, if he was to talk about the ravages of climate change in the way that perhaps David Attenborough does, Sir David Attenborough, that might be okay, or
No.
is it just not an area that he should be talking about at all?
Oh, not at all. It is a political issue. What we do about climate change, how serious climate change. These are contested issues. These are political issues. He should be steering well clear of that.
Well, Albo says it's not partisan. Climate change is not a partisan issue, but I hear what you're saying. I guarantee you the media is waiting for Charles III to make that kind of slip, that the public comment that would be in conflict or potential conflict with the government of the day.
I'm sure Albo would prefer that climate change was a non-partisan issue, but I assure you it is.
Yes, well, yes.
Not
well,
just
we'll
in
see.
Australia, it is around the world.
I honestly believe that that there'll be a great deal of scrutiny over Charles' reign very, very quickly, coming into just where he's going to stand. I suspect he's going to be a relatively silent figure on global issues. I mean, his old man was with the World Wildlife Fund, Jack, and he was talking about extinctions and issues around that. You know, you would say is vaguely political, isn't it?
Yeah, but only vaguely. He was also very fond of shooting pheasants, but,
Yeah, well, there's just as long as they're not shooting pandas.
Your colleague from News Limited, Nick Cater, had some polling results in today's paper, and he had 75% of Australians agreeing that Charles will make a good king, compared to 33% who, in answer to a separate question, say he's weak and out of touch. That will be okay provided he stays out of politics. He won't keep those figures, but he might keep some good figures provided he stays away from political questions. But as soon as he goes into that area...
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why I think the media is standing by watching to see what he's going to do next. And so that's going to be a really crucial thing. I mean, he would be acutely aware, I presume, that there's a Republican movement in the UK, not just here, and that now with the death and funeral of Elizabeth II, some people, if given the right stimulus, might be drawn towards, and I'm talking about in the UK, contemplating the end of the monarchy.
Yes, I don't see any appetite for that at the moment, but it could quickly develop if he's an interfering
that's
king.
The point. And look, personal behaviour and all that sort of stuff will be closely monitored here. What should the Republican movement be doing, Jack? I noticed they suspended the ARM, that is, suspended their discussions on a republic during this period of mourning. I don't know when that ends, whether it ends this week or they're just going to keep quiet for a little while. That's probably the way to play it, isn't it?
Keeping quiet would be pretty good advice, I would think.
Issue of what we do about appointing a head of state, whether it's done by parliamentary appointment, whether it's done by a vote, or their current model is that the states and territories all make nominations, with the federal government making 3. And then we all sit around and vote for what is a sort of list of 10 or so potentials.
Yeah. Their problem with the ARM remains the same, is that there is still a 3-way split between the minimalist Republicans, the presidential Republicans, and the monarchists. And while there's a 3-way split, you can't get a referendum.
Yeah, that's why they've tried to come up with this model that they hope will satisfy those who believe in the election of a head of state and those who believe in a parliamentary appointment. It's sort of the best of the hybrid model, if you like. I don't know that we should even be discussing these things, Jack, on the day that Elizabeth II is interred. I believe she'll be interred in at Westminster Cathedral. Is that correct?
In the chapel
I
at
see.
Windsor Castle, I think,
Well,
is
they're all full of
where she lived.
Westminster. They got quite a few monarchs there, and I think also Darwin, Charles Darwin is buried there in the cathedral there. So okay. So yes, in the cathedral. Did you say Balmoral?
No.
Windsor.
In a private vault at Windsor. Yeah, it's been an interesting demonstration of just how much soft power the United Kingdom retains. We tend to think of them, well, they're a former power, they're a former imperial power, but they do retain a hell of a lot of soft power. The Queen was able to use that quite a lot with the Commonwealth, which is really her crowning glory of her reign as Queen. The Commonwealth's been a huge success. 56 countries, not all of them had anything much to do with the British Empire at all.
Yeah.
And they're still keen to join.
We've seen this here in terms of the guest list, Jack. A lot of countries that have no direct connection with the United Kingdom throughout Europe, throughout the rest of the world.
Brazil is having a day of mourning.
Yeah.
In India, where there are still scars from the days of empire, social scars from the days of empire, they had a.
And
day
we're having
of
one
mourning.
here on Thursday. What about Hong Kong, Jack? What's being done there?
Nothing official. There's been some thousands of people turn up at the British Consulate General here to lay flowers, etc., and sign books, etc. But nothing on a government.
Not adding to the already long list of public holidays.
No, shame really. And it is Monday.
An opportunity missed, really.
Yeah.
Yes, no, Australia will have a public holiday, a one-off on the 22nd, which is, you'd imagine Melburnians are pretty happy about it.
Well, I've had a few complaints from Melbourne relatives that that they've bunged this 4-day weekend on us without notice.
planning.
We haven't had time to plan for it. Mind you, I've got some old Melbourne friends who were never happy about the grand final holiday on the Friday in the first place.
Well, no one used to work. Jack, we'll talk about the AFL grand final week. I mean, you wouldn't have put in a lick of work on a grand final even in your life. I certainly haven't.
Well, a great tradition had developed, as you know, that the chaps who had to go into the office would disappear at lunchtime, about 12:30, and that was
true enough.
That was it for the day. And when the public holiday came in, they weren't very happy about this because they were having to look after the kids at home rather than the kids being tucked up at school.
Yeah, look, and it does make the city very crowded. If you're popping in for a bit of lunch in the city for some of the big events, grand final eve events, and you and I have been to a few of them, all of a sudden you've got to get through the through the parade, the AFL Players Parade, Grand Final Players Parade. I found that I had to run across the road there under the watchful eye of a police officer in order to get to my venue. Yeah, so it's a funny thing, but Melbourne will have 4 days off. Yes, it's just Melbourne only, isn't it? The AFL Grand Final eve as a public holiday, not for rural Victoria.
It'll be interesting to see what the figures are. They're talking about perhaps 4 billion people around the world will watch at least part of today's ceremony. And I'm always a bit sort of suspicious of those. It's like the AFL saying, how many billion people around the world watch the grand final. I never quite believe that, but yes, it won't be. It is a big occasion. There's no doubt about it. It's a big occasion.
Yes, no, you'd imagine that sort of figure will run, and to it depends on how you measure it, but if anyone's caught sight of coverage of the funeral, you'd imagine that would be well into the billions, well into from 4 billion. Well, that's half of us basically. Now on to more mundane matters, Jack. I read a piece by David Pemberthy, who's the South Australian a correspondent, and also a Talkback Radio man now and former editor of the Daily Telegraph. And he made some reasonable points about Twitter and journalism. and we've sort of talked about this. I don't sort of go for this business that journalists should avoid it, and I wasn't entirely sure whether that was Pembo saying that this is the case, but he did mention the late great journalist Mark Colvin as a practitioner of what Twitter used to be and probably still should be. Mark was a very close friend of mine, and there is a great certainty. I certainly felt it and spoke to a lot of journalists at his funeral who said that they felt a gaping hole had come into the industry with Mark leaving us. And I'm not quite sure how well Pembo would know Mark Colvin, perhaps a little in passing. But did you read the piece? What did you make
I
of
did
it?
indeed. I generally enjoy Penbo's pieces in this train.
Yeah, he gets away with saying shit. He does get away with using the word shit, which is generally frowned upon. But he got away with it. Shit canned. He does. So he does have that sort of easy way of writing and in a measured sort of way. He's a very, very fine writer. There are some, beyond his relationship or not with Mark Colvin, and citing Mark as the sort of god, the fallen god of Twitter. He does make some very good points. I use Twitter a lot less now than I used to. And I tend to just respond with people. I also sort of follow the DMs a bit as well. I tend not to spend any great chunks of time on it. I think that's where I think journalists can go wrong. But he does talk about, God, when I read some of these things and I do flip through, the general timeline, and I see the sort of attacks on Lisa Miller, who's an ABC correspondent who does their breakfast show, and I think she's in London now to cover the funeral. It's just awful. I mean, it's just
Who from the ABC is not in London covering the funeral?
Well, yeah, true enough. They've got the whole breakfast team over there, and she's one. And I did see some tweets saying now that she's overseas now, we can she can stay there. We won't let her back into the country. That sort of stuff. She's perceived to hold a right wing line, and that might be that she's asked questions of perhaps someone like Anthony Albanese or Dan Andrews over the journey, and those questions have been perceived by large chunks of the Twitter audience as being in some way biased.
Well, the best point that David Pemberthy made, I think, is that for a profession that used to pride itself on loving argument, the journalists on Twitter are really searching for agreement, demanding agreement with each other. And that's boring for starters. And it's contrary to the best traditions of the profession, of the craft.
Well, I guess the response to it is, look, I tend to agree with you, but I guess the response to that is that they're actually, people, and mentioned in this column are Barry Cassidy, the former Insiders host. I guess implicit in this is your mate, but not mine, Mike Carlton. And there are one or two at News Corp who don't get mentioned, or ex-News Corp journos who now are railing about News Corp media dominance and all this sort of stuff, which is really tiresome. Because as Pembo points out, or in fact his colleague and mine, John Ferguson, said, if they all filed from the altar of perfection, then good luck. I just never heard the screams of revulsion when they were putting the next round on expenses, which is a lot.
I did enjoy reading that, I must say. I thought that was excellent from John Ferguson.
Yes, Fergie's a wonderful man. And very, very, very amusing company. Look.
Pembo went on to say...
Carlton does get a mention. Paul Bongiorno, he has just become almost, sort of... It's pontificating on Twitter. And I think that's a grave mistake.
Well, he's rediscovered The Art of Giving Sermons that he did when he was a priest, I think, Paul Bongiorno. He's gone back
maybe
to
it's
the.
typecast.
He does seem to think that we're all sitting patiently in the pews waiting for him to fill our minds with wisdom.
Look, my view on Twitter is that it has besides being, it can be an echo chamber. It can be people from one broad political affiliation sort of talking amongst themselves. It's not always like that. The times that I've found Twitter to be very useful as a journalist are when big stories are breaking, because you do get that people on the ground telling you what's happening. I'm trying to think of a good example, but the tsunami and earthquakes that affected the nuclear power plants at Fukushima are a very good example. That you were getting that news from Twitter before you were getting it from mainstream media. Generally speaking, about half an hour to an hour ahead. And just in terms of what was going on there, it looked to be a complete meltdown. Now, I just use that as an example of a major news event and how that can roll. Where it gets really ugly is in the postscript to all of that. So, another example I can think of, the Islamic State terrorist outrage in Paris that had us all shocked. Now, Twitter, again, very, very good at delivering basic information about what was happening at the time. And then as the day wore on, media moved in, and obviously police and security agencies moved in, and so forth. So essentially, the incident was over, and many people had been killed, and that's when Twitter got really, really ugly. Very good at news dissemination in the early stages, but then when people had a chance to ponder what had happened, then that echo chamber came forward.
Well, it is an echo chamber. As I said, most of the people on Twitter, and Twitter is largely a progressive medium.
Oh, there's no doubt about that, yeah.
What they really are searching for is agreement. I always had this kind of mental picture that before Mike Carlton or Peter Fitzsimons or Barry Cassidy or these people tweet anything, they kind of ring each other up and make sure they're all on the same page. You know?
Oh, well, that's the same sort of conspiracy theory that affects News Corp, that we all sort of gather at midnight and strangle cats and work out what we're going to be writing about today as a sort of echo chamber as well. So, yeah, not a lot to be said about that, but people of the ilk of Barry Cassidy, who I know, will drop these things in, and they are looking for. Well, I don't think Barry would be obsessed about likes, but he really wants to make a point to what are very substantial numbers. I think there are something like 2 million users on Twitter. No, I think it's higher. It's actually 3 million users. It remains to be seen how many of them are regular users. There'd be data available for that. But yeah, there's this long sort of line of journalists like that, and you would have also come across someone by the name of Ronnie Saltjack in your Twitter musings yourself, or your following of Twitter.
Can't say I have.
Oh, it's an interesting one. It's obviously a nom de plume. We don't know who that person is. This person may or may not have had some sort of connection to a news organisation. And that particular person does write for occasionally. I'm just trying to think who she writes for, whether it's the Independent Australia or some other column, but never disclosed who her name is, and also sort of has a way of getting a story out about politicians. There we go. Can I just give you a give you an example? There's a woman by the name of Elizabeth Marr who's talking about Piers Morgan, and she said, "I read that his vendetta against Megan started because he claimed she was happy to be friendly with him prior to a marriage, and then she dumped him didn't want to speak to him. So being a dysfunctional sociopath, he launched his campaign to destroy both Harry and Meghan. Ronnie Salt replies, the problem is, Elizabeth, you and everyone else has no idea any of that happened at all. So you only have the say-so of Piers Morgan, a dead girl's phone tapper, an inveterate liar. There is no proof anywhere for any of his claims. It all comes out from his mouth alone. So that's a pretty good example of the sort of stuff Ronnie Salt, who is, as I say, a pseudonym, comes up with.
Piers normally responds to the dead girl's phone tapper by saying, well, you've got a day to withdraw, you've got some hours to withdraw that, or I'll sue you, and they always do, because it isn't true. Personally,
it can't be proven. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think he's actually right. That wasn't him. That was somebody else who did that. In any event, Twitter, I find, can be a really good source of information, because some people on Twitter link to good information, good news reporting that I otherwise wouldn't see. So I enjoy that. And apart from that, I just find it immensely entertaining. Because I enjoy people making dicks of themselves in public, and people are very inclined to do that on Twitter.
It is a great way to spend a day, or a couple of hours in the day. Yeah, look, that was Mark's great gift to Twitter, and he had, I think, over 100,000 followers, and he would link to stories of note around the world that were either being missed or perhaps underreported by the mainstream media. So that was his great gift, and he was a profoundly good journalist, and as I say, very, very good friend of mine, and a person who had so much to tell you. There were just wonderful stories. He was in Iran for the Iranian, at the time of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. He was there when Khomeini came to rule in Tehran, and he tells a story about how Khomeini's followers grabbed them, all foreign journalists, put them all on a couple of buses and took them outside Tehran, where there were just literally mounds of bodies of those that had been disposed of because they were seen to be a threat, and then dragged the journalists out of a bus and said, here you go, film this, report this, you tell the world this is what we do. And it's just an astonishing thing. I mean, he was in Rwanda during the genocide there. In fact, that's where he became quite ill. He picked up a tropical illness that just didn't get diagnosed for a very, very long time. He became very ill in London and was given so much cortisone that basically rendered his bones into chalk. And that's a slight overstatement, but he had problems with mobility ever since, and also blew his kidney out. Blew kidney function away, and of course that led to him being on dialysis for a long time, often there 2-3 days a week on dialysis at St Vincent's in Sydney, and also then he received a transplant, and there was a brilliant moment where a brilliant period where Mark was pretty much all better for a little while, and then, as I said before, he developed cancer and passed away, leaving a huge hole in journalism in this country.
Yeah, well, I think the information stuff's important, but never underestimate the importance of and the joy that you can get from watching people make complete clowns of themselves.
Well, it's also a format that's given to the quip, the smart ass remark. And I'd like to think I do a little bit of that on it. I really am only in it for the humour these days. If I do see a major story, if I'm aware of a major story developing, I will look it up to see what people might be saying about it. But other than that, I'm just in it mainly for the gags.
Yep, same with me.
All right, so that's Twitter and whether journalists should be a part of it. I suspect they shouldn't be told what not to do, but they shouldn't be too serious about adopting Twitter as as a force. It used to be really good. You could sort of, link to your own articles and then put it up, and you might sort of expand your readership, but that doesn't work anymore. You can put it up there and there'll be a couple of likes and a couple of retweets, but it's really not about that anymore. It's really about, getting out there, being a bit sanctimonious and getting your point across, and in response, hopefully, someone taking the piss out of it, someone like me. All right, Jack. Well, we've got a listener's letter, which I have, and I do apologise about this. We have been a little bit loath in putting forward. I'll get to that in a minute, and I do apologise, but I just want to take you to see our parliaments have all been suspended, Jack, with the royal funerals and period of mourning and what have you. So it means that the minor parties are really sort of battling to get a point across. So it came in the New South Wales Upper House member Upper House member David Shoebridge, Greens member David Shoebridge, just repeated Greens policy. And it is a beautiful, wonderful thing. A legislated minimum wage of no less than 60% of the median Australian full-time wage, which I think is about $80,000 now. So 60% of that is the legislated minimum wage. And a transition toward a 4-day or equivalent standard working week with no reduction in overall pay, Jack. Happy days. Isn't this wonderful?
You can rely on the Greens, can't you?
And one or two more public holidays. Why not around grand final time? So there it was. I mean, what sort of would this just be a terrible wreck? If you're working 38 hours a week and you're able to do that in 4 rather than 5, wouldn't that be a good thing in terms of productivity?
Well, it depends what sort of business you're in.
Yeah. So,
as indeed does the minimum wage. I mean, the problem with having a high minimum wage is that you cut from the prospect of employment people who can't do something at that level.
So we're talking about unskilled, semi-skilled sort of workers, and them working, let's say, piecework in a factory, for example, or assembly work in a factory, for example. You can employ them, though. Surely you can just get them to do their 38 hours over 4 rather than 5.
It isn't so much the piecework in the factory. It's someone who puts on someone to sweep a few floors and do a few things like that. If that's just not economic, they don't get any work.
That's the thing, isn't it? That's the thing. Now, the French have had some experience on this. They went to a 4-day working week, didn't they? And I'm not sure where we are.
And they have the 8 weeks holiday a year and all that sort of stuff.
Got to move to France. I've had a look at some real estate there, and it's pretty cheap. It's not Sydney, a bit cheaper than Sydney. So got to get there. Got to get along there. So you get the 8 weeks. You get the 8 weeks annual leave, and you're working 4 days a week.
I think it might be 6 officially,
right.
But I've got a pal here who was notorious for having sick days when he worked for a British bank here. In our local pub there was a chalkboard with the number of sick days he had. But now that he's moved to a French bank, it's perfectly okay. They think he's the hardest working bloke in the place.
Just can't get rid of him. He's there all day. Look, it's a strange thing. French economy is not. Well, it's not doing as badly as the UK. So it's not as if these things are absolutely catastrophic. And maybe we do need to talk about them. I have this view that we should be talking a lot more about work than we do, because it is really the biggest thing outside of family. It's the biggest thing in our lives. So why not talk about alternatives to work, alternatives to your actual hours? I mean, I think if you're a nurse working in intensive care and you work a 10-hour shift 4 days a week, and most of them work longer than that, to be fair. That basically should be it. That they have 4 on, 3 off.
Horses for courses, in my view. This is a matter that should be worked out to suit particular jobs, particular industries, and particular organisations or companies.
You can't just impose that across the board. I mean, if you
No.
did bring in a minimum wage that was, let's say, 60% of 80,000, so nearly $50,000 as a minimum wage, that's a spike of, gee whiz, a good $25,000 a year. It's not going to be good for a lot of small businesses, is it?
And it's not going to be good for a lot of people who are on low incomes because those jobs will disappear.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good point. Now, look, I got myself a little bit tied up, but we did have a sort of vaguely related question from our listener Shane. I appreciate your patience in me reading this, Shane. And this is related to sort of education and training. He's throwing a few ideas around, Jack. He said, Jack, still loving hard hats and high vis. Definitely worth continuing your weekly focus on domestic politics. This is the hard hats and high vis. We do another program called Around the World, and he urges us to keep it up. Would like to hear your thoughts on the education sector. Serious issues of workplace practices, workload and pay in a field that has a clear economic and social benefit. How have the education unions and government allowed it to get to this? I guess he's saying that our educational standards aren't terribly high. Where have the wheels fallen off? What policies going forward should we consider? Cut funding to private schools, lift teacher pay, make teachers work 38 hours a week. I reckon most of them work a good deal more than that. Keen to get your thoughts. Thanks, Shane. So thank you, Shane, for that. And then he goes on to say, having the feds take over education could also be an option. Unfortunately, we still have many interpretations of a national curriculum, plenty of options, but never a policy area that gets the attention it deserves. It probably does, is my short answer to that, Shane, that we have way too much focus on some of the minutiae of national curriculum, and that fills up a lot of op-eds as we go forward. So, is it broken first, Jack? Is our education and training system broken?
I'm a little out of touch with it. My kids are sort of through the education system now.
I do, yeah, and I'm glad of it, by the way.
Yeah. I think there are some things that we have lost from the time when I was going through education in the 60s and 70s that I think we're probably better there, and I think we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater to some extent. The high schools were good. We had in Victoria at least, we had an excellent tech school system because an academic education system doesn't benefit everybody. There are always going to be people who are better off in a tech school, learning a trade, learning a craft, doing something like that. And we've kind of gotten rid of that. We haven't looked after that well enough.
Yeah, well, the tech schools are pretty much all gone now. The issue around them, and it is something that should probably not have occurred, but the issue around it was that how do we stream kids into technical training, and how do we determine whether they should be pursuing other academic pursuits? I think that was the sort of problem that there was a distinction around that was saying kids from certain backgrounds should be going straight into technical schools, and kids who are perhaps higher up on the socioeconomic scale, they should be pursuing an academic education. And I think that was the difficulty with that area. Having said that, it would be very beneficial to have our schools with training and trade skills made available to them right now, so kids can actually make those choices as they go.
I think your dad taught at Preston Tech, didn't he?
He did. So did my mother, right? Yeah, both taught at Preston Tech. And there were some pretty rough kids in those days too. It did offer kids who perhaps were never going to finish school, and this is the point. So everyone's finished the school now. Everyone, you can't not finish HSC and continue in Australia. There are so many jobs that you simply won't be able to do or won't be employed to do. So everyone finishes going to HSC, and then they make the decision about trade training.
So I think that's a mistake. We've also gotten to the point where we're priding ourselves on how many people go to university, and I don't really think going to university is of a great deal of benefit for a lot of people. It is for some, but not for everybody. So I think we need to move back a little bit closer to what it was in the 1960s. The other thing is I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I love the selective state schools. I've got no problem with government money going to private schools, but I love the selective state schools because I think they offer a ladder of opportunity for the disadvantaged in the community. You look at something like Fort Street Boys High School in Sydney, 5 High Court judges have come through Fort Street, including Michael Kirby, Edmund Barton, the Prime Minister, Doc Everett, the President of the United Nations.
But the problem with that approach, and look at Melbourne High School, for example, is another select school. McGregor, I think it's McGregor Girls High as well.
Mac Robertson,
I should say. Mac Robertson is the sort of sister school for that. And there's Hurlston in New South Wales as well, and they consistently come up with the best HSC results every time. But the problem is, in terms of who gets there, that selection is basically determined at year 7, which is way too young.
Yes, I agree with that. They would be better off as 3-year high schools.
What about teachers, Jack? Are they failing their kids? I was talking to a teacher on Saturday night, and I presume a very, very good one. And she was saying that it is incredibly difficult to teach kids now. Not just from a discipline point of view, although there is that, but you have got large groups of kids who really don't have a lot of good language and numeracy skills getting into the higher levels of secondary education.
Well, that's surely a problem for the lower levels of education if they're getting there without that.
They won't keep them back much these days, mate. And so you are getting kids who have basically got through somehow, and this is not just something within the state system, by the way, who have got through somehow with the view that, we'll sort it all out by year 10 or year 11 or then year 12. And while you've got, that 11 and 12 group, as I understand talking to teachers, is that they're serious. The kids doing it then, they're quite serious. But it's that year 9 and 10, that can be a real problem. That's when kids start going off the rails too, particularly boys. And if they're getting into the education system at that stage, at 14, 15 years of age, and they've got no literacy skills, I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a tough one to fix. That's where you need to have the bifurcation, if you like, between the more technical approach and the academic approach.
Yeah. So do teachers get paid enough?
I'm not really sure exactly what they get paid now. I think the problem is
about 70. So you're basically your average wage, and that's pretty much straight out of college. So about 70.
I think one of the problems is that the pay scales for teachers is too flat. That is, when you graduate from college, you probably start at a better pay than a young lawyer starts, but you don't go up. So everyone gets paid the same thing, more or less.
Well, they say that about police, that you're straight out of the academy on a pretty healthy wage, but then you really got to
then nothing happens.
Yeah, nothing happens for a long time until you become a senior constable. Yeah. So the lawyers eventually catch up. Yeah.
Yeah, so the lawyer will start on a rate, and if they're good, and if they're making money for the firm, they very quickly go up to quite a good part.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
But that's a problem with the education pay scales, is that you start too high and don't move enough from there on, in my view.
And that's got to come through things like peer assessment. So teachers
Yes.
shouldn't be worried or concerned about other teachers coming into their classrooms and making assessments and speaking with them, confidentially, not in front of a class, but speaking to them afterwards about how you can maybe change things, maybe consult further, plan better, all those sorts of things. I would think the best way forward for teachers is to have a regular process of peer assessment.
Well, the rest of us in the workforce, we all have to go through some kind of assessment. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or a public servant or whatever, you've all got to go through some kind of assessment. Someone's judging you all the time to work out how much you should get paid. Teachers have made a mistake in avoiding that, and that's holding them back.
All right. So we hope that's answered at least some of your questions, Shane. Just to round this off, I actually don't think that we're going all that badly. I mean, we can compare ourselves to the Finns and the Chinese in terms of...
Or the Singaporeans generally.
And I don't know that that's the right way of going about it. Certainly we should be looking at primary schools, dealing with kids evenly in terms of delivering literacy and numeracy. There's a difficulty here, and we really haven't addressed this as a society because there is no precedent. We've never seen people who just flip through their phones and are looking at screens for large periods of the day, and that is generally young people and old people as well. But what are the consequences of that in terms of literacy, numeracy, etc.? I don't think we've even begun to understand some of the things that are coming our way as a result of that. All right, moving on to sport. Sorry, John.
Just before we leave that, there's a bit to unpack there. Shane, no, I wouldn't give it to the feds to run. There's enough one out
worst
of
thing you can do.
Yeah.
Worst thing you can do. Yes, there should be an education ministry, federally, and yes, we should have coordinated and national curriculum. But, yeah, it's got to be delivered by the states because they do that and they've been doing it for a long time and they know what they're doing. All right, under sport, Jack. But before we get into the results of finals and so forth, the great Alan Aylett passed away on Friday as we record. That's the 15th of September when he passed away. He was an absolutely huge figure for Australian football. The Victorian Football League became the AFL pretty much as he was president of it. He was a great player at North Melbourne, played over 200 games, a Brownlow medalist, but probably one of the great sports administrators of our time. Took North Melbourne to their first premiership in the days of Ronald Dale Barassi coaching the club, and then went on to become essentially the chair of the Victorian Football League, and basically you would say is the kind of father of the AFL.
Yeah, he was a dentist. Dentist,
yeah. He still had the practice going when he was at North, when he was the president at North.
Yeah. Always known as Doc Aylett. Never saw him play, but I met plenty of people who did see him play. He played for a North team that wasn't much good, to be fair.
Well, they did have some moments, and Alan was a great ball player. Like you, I didn't see him play, but he'd have people like Alan Mantello and Max Ritchie looking after him. They were the original shin boners, mate. Those blokes.
They were. But he was a new type of president for the VFL when he got the job. And he surrounded himself with people like Barry Sheetley, Max Ritchie, Albert Mantello, these sort of people who really took North Melbourne from a pretty nowhere kind of club, really, to a couple of premierships.
Never won one. Never won one. They were one of the last admitted sides, and they never won one until Alan came in and changed the very nature of the club.
Yes. And then after he'd done that, he then went on to become president of the VFL, and again, he changed the way the VFL worked. He was a much more corporate club president and then a much more corporate VFL president. And he kind of set in train the sort of changes that have made the AFL the force it is in sport in Australia today. I've been a little disappointed, to be quite honest, that his death the death of Doc Ayler hasn't had anywhere near the coverage it should have had,
it's-
because he was a huge figure in sport in Australia.
It's been overlooked, and I'm waiting to see what sort of mention it will come in the grand final. He really was the sort of the grandfather, if you like, of the AFL. He also, so you basically, regardless of it's 18 teams or 12, or you're always dealing with parochial interests, and he was able to basically create a body that sort of overcame those issues. He got the Swans up to Sydney. They're playing the grand final this weekend, and really the national competition began in his tenure as chair of the VFL.
Without Doc Ayler, they would be 10 years behind where they are today.
Yes, RIP. One of the greats as a player and also an administrator, a man of great vision. RIP Alan Aylett. And Jack, onto the Brownlow, a controversial winner, not for me. Patrick Cripps, I thought he would be a good thing, actually, and you could get him at fairly good odds. Lockie Neal was the favourite, beaten, and pretty much in the last call of the night. And a lot of people have been saying that he shouldn't have been playing at all. Shouldn't have been playing at all in the game that he got the 3 votes against Collingwood, who's clearly the best man on the ground that day. But they're referring to his collision with the Lions player Archie, I think, and Archie was concussed and missed a couple of games. Jack, what do you think? Is it the fairest and best?
Oh, I don't think it's been the fairest and best for a good while.
It probably never was it really? But it is umpires' votes, and for those people who don't follow it closely, the umpires get together, and the field umpires, they don't listen to the goal umpires or the boundary umpires, but the field umpires will get together. There's 3 of them, and they'll figure out their 3-2-1s for each game they umpire. And they called Patrick Cripps. I think one of the stunning things about it is that he got 3 BOGs in 2 losing games, and that's what Patrick Cripps gives you every time. As a Carlton supporter, you're often in awe of the way he just throws his body in, picks up the team, puts them on the shoulder, and says, "Righto, boys, here we go." But yeah,
After a couple of years or 18 months or so, where he was, I don't know whether he was playing wounded or what, but he was sort of falling away. He's come right back to his best.
Yeah, definitely injured last year. Had some surgery this year. But look, he came to the club not known for his running abilities. He was very, very slow over the 4K time trial, and now he's in the front 4 or 5. So that tells you just how committed he's been. He's a very, very large human being as well, Jack, for a midfielder, and very hard to stop. A great win from a Carlton barracker. A great win to see Carlton pick up the Brownlow, and of course the goal kicking medal as well. Managed to snaffle that as well. So happy days. And of course, that all rounded off the weekend of the AFL, where the Cats moved into a grand final after giving the Lions a nice old shellacking. And the Pies v Swans, as if we couldn't have predicted it, went down to the wire with the Pies just falling a point short. It won so many close games, but couldn't manage that one.
A cracking game.
Terrific.
One of the best finals games you'll see. It wasn't pretty. There wasn't much time or space for players, but it was just a great spectacle. And, of course, 45,000 at the SCG for a preliminary final. The atmosphere, fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic atmosphere. You get 45 at the SCG. It's like 90 at the MCG. Drove home. I was in Sydney on Saturday night. Missed the second half. Caught the replay yesterday. But driving home down the Hume, lots of Collingwood people down there, lots of banners flying, scarves in the windows, all that sort of stuff, and some good human banter in the roadhouses, Jack. Lots of Pies had made their way up to watch their side, and they could be very, very pleased with the season Collingwood have had. They've really stepped up this year.
Yeah, Richard Hines on Twitter put it pretty well, I thought. He said, look, premierships are pretty hard to win. There's 18 clubs. You're not going to win them very often. But if you didn't enjoy, if you're a Pies fan, and he's a Pies fan, if you're a Pies fan and you didn't enjoy this season, you're doing football wrong.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we'll see that this week because we've got the AFL Grand Final week, the parade, all the sort of build-up. And of course, the Cats will play the Swans at the MCG in front of 100,000 people. But what we see, if a side gets beaten in a grand final, they're almost shamed, aren't they? You know, particularly if they get well beaten. But they've actually finished two. There's another 16 sides that have gone worse than them. But there'll be a focus on them having lost it. It's just the way it works. Who do you think's going to win, Jack? I know what the heart will be saying.
Oh, the heart's definitely with the Swans, but look, the Cats have been the best side since the mid-season bye.
Yeah.
And the next two best teams have been the Pies and the Swans, who have been very, very good as well, and not too far behind. So it starts at 2:30 on Saturday afternoon. It's 0-0. It starts even.
So there we go. Yeah, and we hope that both sides can get their best 22 on the park.
And the joy of sport is that there's chance involved. It needs a little bit of luck.
Yeah, look, indeed. Look, by the way, I did watch the game last night, and I'm not always prepared to give umpires a free ride, but I thought the umpiring on the weekend was excellent. And the AFL, Australian rules football, a very difficult game to umpire. And I thought they were terrific. I think they just let it go. And let a lot of these holding the ball decisions go. Let a lot of these things go. Just let the players play, and intervene when you have to. Bit different from the rugby union on Thursday night.
Indeed. The umpires weren't trying to be the stars of the show. By the way,
never seen anyone, Jack, who pays their money to go and watch people umpire.
No, Nigel Owens, the great Welsh, I think he's Welsh, isn't he? The referee, rugby referee from the UK. He was finally tracked down and asked what he thought of the decision by referee Matthew Ronald.
This is the time wasting at the Bledisloe on Thursday.
The Bledisloe Cup, and he actually he backed his fellow ref. He thought it was fair. He thought it was okay. But my view of that is, it was a very selective enforcement of a problem that rugby has, which is that there's way too much time wasting in the game.
Yeah.
And this was a very selective enforcement of the time wasting rule.
And they've only just got to look at the code next to them and figure out what they do. So in the NRL, you don't see that level of stoppage. And you still have the collision type injuries, and you still have the breaks in play and so forth, just while they're umpiring decisions being made or being sent upstairs for review. But they still manage to keep things rolling. And I think that's something the ARU could learn from. Or sorry, you not just the ARU, but
rugby generally.
Yeah, rugby generally. And that brings us to
one of my American mates says if you're watching a rugby game on the television, you spend about 40 minutes watching a fat bloke getting his legs rubbed.
You do. It does happen quite a lot. Yes, okay. And that leads us, just as we go out to the NRL, the Bunnies. The Rabbitohs, our Prime Minister's side, through to play the Panthers in the prelim this weekend coming, after defeating the Sharks 38-12. The Eels smashed the Raiders and put them away for the season, and they will go on to play the Cowboys. I have a feeling the Eels might go okay there. I mean, the Cowboys have had the week off, and I'm not sure that it's a great advantage in rugby league. So I'm going for the Eels and the Panthers to make their way through. The Bunnies will come up against a very, very good side, the best side in it this year, I should say.
Now, speaking of the Bunnies being the Prime Minister's side, he's also, I can tell you, a Swans fan. The first time I met Albo, it was 2005, grand final night. We were in the lounge at the Qantas Lounge at Tullamarine, heading back after after a Swans grand final win. And I was there with a mate who's a mutual friend, and we had a beer with Elbow, and he was very much a Swans fan.
Oh, look, he's about to have a very, very big weekend too. He should be back in Australia by then, so he'll be at the AFL Grand Final at the G. Do you recommend that he hands out the cup, Jack?
That's always a mistake.
Don't do that.
That's always a mistake.
I'm sure his mind is well across that. Hawkey got booed. That's how long ago it's been happening. And then I think he just said, "I'm not doing that anymore." And so they don't. Yeah, they don't use the prime ministers anymore. It's not much fun. And even when the cameras cut away to the VIP sitting there, there's usually a few boos just because you're the prime minister. Doesn't matter whether you're popular or not.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, stay away from the cameras, Elbow, and you'll have a good weekend. Go Swannies. We'll talk next week in the wrap up of the AFL Grand Final season, and I think the Eels should give the Cowboys a bit of a touch up and make their way to the NRL Grand Final, almost certainly to play Panthers. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack, for your time and consideration of this broad range of issues that is completely dominated by the royal funeral. And as speaking as someone in the media and a consumer of it, I look forward to a time when we don't have this sort of preponderance of royal funerals.
Cheers, mate.
All right, mate. All the best. And we'd like to thank our listeners for tuning in as usual. And we would ask you, if you do have some comments, drop it to me, just like our mate Shane did. Drop it to me on our Twitter DMs, and we'll get to it without a shadow of a doubt. Regardless of what you have to say, if you've got some questions, if you've got some criticisms, if you've got some compliments, chuck them in and we'll deal with them. And I also ask you to drop us a line at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. But you can easily get me on DMs, on my Twitter DMs at Jack the Insider. Thank you all for your time, and we'll talk next week.